Yeah, so today we're going to be talking about stillwater breeding amphibians that you can find in Thurston County. Um, so just to preface this, if you ever want a good kind of amphibian ID guides for how to identify any of the frogs, newts, salamanders, anything like that here in Washington, these two books I highly, highly recommend. One of them has a few more detailed pictures than the other one. The Lone Pine one has a few more detailed pictures, but they're both really great. So when we talk about amphibians, we're kind of referring to three different orders of amphibians. So anurans, which are going to be our frogs and toads, caudata, which is going to be our salamanders and newts, and gymnophonia or apoda, which are Sicilians, which we do not have here in Washington. So we will not worry about those little dudes today. Generally speaking, when we kind of break amphibians down into the groups that we're looking at, we have flowing water species, upland species, and stillwater species. So stillwater species are the ones that we will be talking about today. These are frogs and salamanders that generally breed and live around still water, so wetlands, lakes, ponds, anything like that. We do have 5 species of upland amphibians, but they are all salamanders. And what uplands means is that they actually do not need water in order to lay their eggs. So they are strictly terrestrial salamanders. And then we have our flowing water species, which are going to be restricted to streams and rivers, obviously flowing water. This is where you're going to get like Van Dyke salamanders, which are endemic here in Washington, and our Pacific giant salamanders. So those are going to be our flowing water species, but we're not worrying about them. We're talking about stillwater breeders today. And before we kind of jump into it, I think it's really important to acknowledge the cultural significance of amphibians. So we know that amphibians play a really good role in our ecosystems, but culturally they also play a really significant role, especially when we talk about many like Pacific Northwest indigenous cultures. So in a lot of these cultures and their folklore, we hear that frogs are associated with springtime and renewal, which makes sense because when we start hearing frogs calling, when we start seeing them lay their egg masses, it's springtime. And so it's a really good indicator that spring is coming, there's more light, there's going to be more flowers. So they're really good indicators of that in indigenous cultures. And they do have a lot of different types of meanings, both good and bad. There are some indigenous tribes that associate frogs with like greed and wealth. But for the most part, they tend to signify transformation, wisdom, and flow because they're usually found in water. So to kick everything off, the first salamander we are going to talk about is the long-toed salamander. Now, these are our earliest breeding amphibians in Thurston County. These little salamanders will actually start breeding as early as January, with some reports breeding as early as late December. And so really what they need is this kind of cold snap to happen, and then it'll start warming up, and then they will make their way to these little ponds. And these guys can be kind of hard for people to differentiate between some of our other terrestrial salamanders like Western redbacks. But a really good way to identify these guys is one, by this super long toe on their back hind limbs. So that is dead giveaway. That's why they are called long-toed salamanders. For once, you know, biologist actually named something appropriately. But also this stripe down their back kind of looks like somebody took a mustard bottle and just squirted mustard all down the back. So it's not super clean, it's kind of patchy, and that's a really good way to identify those little dudes too. The stripe can be in different colors, so you get gold, yellow, sometimes green, and their egg packets that they lay are really small. So they're not going to be these kind of like massive egg masses that you would expect to see with some of our other amphibians we'll talk about today. So they lay these really small egg packets. And something really important to note, and I'll talk about this with each of the amphibians we talk about today, we can't distinguish how many females are in a pond based on how many egg masses are in that pond with long-toed salamanders. And that's because females can actually lay more than one egg packet at a time. And so these egg packets can contain anywhere from one little egg to 3 up to 27. So they can kind of vary in the size. But for the most part, their little egg packets are pretty small. They're super jelly-like. So a good way to kind of distinguish these from maybe like a little rock that's sitting on the bottom is if you put your foot in the water and lightly tap it, you'll actually see the jelly of the egg mass kind of move. So that's a really good way to see these egg masses. So long-toed salamanders will also usually only lay their eggs in ephemeral sites, so sites that the water is going to dry up eventually. And the reason for that is because they're trying to avoid predation. So you're not going to get things like bullfrogs or fish or a lot of these other predatory animals in ponds where the water dries up. And so because of this, they're pretty quick to go from their egg stage to their larval stage and pop out and eventually metamorph out into their terrestrial form. So their egg packets are very small, like I said, usually less than 2 inches long, 1 to 25 eggs within each packet. And this jelly will break down fairly quickly, and they will lay their egg packets on a brace, but females will also lay their egg packets underneath leaves or just on the bottom of a pond, and they get sediment on them really easily, which is why they can be mistaken for rocks, which is why the water tapping to see the jelly flowing is a really good way to kind of pick these out. The eggs themselves, like the little larval inside, are distinctly bicolored, so you'll get kind of brown above and white below. And a really good way to identify a salamander, especially with ambystomatids, a salamander egg mass or egg packet from a frog, is that salamanders will have what's called a double membrane around the egg itself. So you have this big jelly around the outside, right? And then you'll have 2 membranes that are around here. And I have a picture later on where you can see this a little more clearly. So again, like this female went all along this stick and just laid a bunch of single eggs. Instead of laying them all in one packet, she laid them all individually. Why they choose to lay just one multiple times or a bunch in a packet, I couldn't tell you. So these are just more examples of what they look like as they start to develop. And as you can see, before they pop out, you get little salamander embryos, and you can see their little gills forming, and oftentimes you'll see balancers, and these balancers kind of help the embryos like stay afloat and stay balanced, and those will eventually absorb inside of them as they start growing. So this is the double membrane that I was referring to. So this whole outside area is that kind of jelly type structure. And then inside of the jelly structure, you have the egg and these 2 distinct membranes wrapped around it. And like I said, that's a really important feature when you're trying to distinguish salamanders from frogs, because frogs are not going to have that double membrane around that egg. All right. So northern red-legged frogs are going to be our next kind of like early spring, late winter breeders. I'm going to hope that this works, and it might be a little loud. You are more likely than not never going to hear a northern red-legged frog call because males actually call underneath the water. But just in case you are curious, I figured I would play their call for you all.
Northern red-legged frog, Rana aurora.
So they kind of sound like a Predator from the movie Predators. But like I said, you're less likely to hear these frogs as compared to some of our later ones that we'll talk about. So northern red-legged frogs are a fairly decent sized frog. They have a red or pink wash kind of in their groin area. And they have, so when we're talking about frogs and like identifying, a lot of times you'll hear people talk about dorsal lateral fold. And what that is this kind of weird ridge that goes along the frog. And so some frogs, like bullfrogs, won't have this at all. So it'll just kind of wrap around their tympanum or their eardrum. But with the northern red-legged frog, this goes all the way down, but there's a slight break in it kind of near where the ear is. So that's also a good way to identify them if you're kind of looking up top and you don't have the frog like in hand. That's a good way to identify those frogs from like bullfrogs. They can be spotted, but that's really irregular. So you get some that have a lot of spotting, some that have none at all. And they have reduced webbing on their feet, which is really important because reduced webbing on their feet means that they are not a strictly aquatic frog. So northern red-legged frogs spend a lot of time in the riparian area, which is why riparian buffers around wetlands and ponds and stuff where red-legged frogs are breeding is super important. So they have this reduced webbing because they're really only going into water to breed and to lay their eggs. Their larvae can be fairly large, kind of similar to bullfrog larvae. And kind of a way to distinguish them from bullfrogs is sometimes this fin will go up further on the head and make it look like they have little mohawks. And another way to kind of identify that these aren't strictly aquatic frogs is that their eyes kind of sit to the side. So they don't sit like up top like an aquatic frogs would be because they're not in the water that much. So yeah, those are like good ways to identify the adults. They're pretty, I want to say they're like fairly like common looking frogs. But there are some other frogs in Washington that share very similar characteristics to them, which is why the red or pink wash and then the break in that fold are really important for identifying them. As far as their egg masses go, their egg masses are about softball size, so they're pretty large. And the way that I always tell people to distinguish kind of like these large like frog egg masses from some of our larger salamander egg masses is things like red-legged frogs or like cascade frogs, Columbia spotted frogs or Oregon spotted frogs, is that their egg masses look like singular grapes that are just kind of pushed together. And so it almost seems like you could just pop one of these eggs just like right off from the other one, and there's no real form to their egg mass. And so if you were to scoop up a red-legged frog egg mass and try to hold it in your hand, it's going to start sinking through your fingers because there's no real structure. So it's going to start like flattening out. And this is why like a lot of times you see these egg masses floating in the middle of wetlands or the middle of lakes, because females will typically try to brace their egg masses on something, but as they start absorbing water and kind of like growing outward, they break off from that brace because there's no structure to it, and then they'll start floating off. Their egg mass jelly breaks down pretty quickly. And unlike the long-toed salamander, we can distinguish how many females are in a pond for red-legged frogs, because female red-legged frog is only going to lay one egg mass. And so if we're in a pond and you see 4 red-legged frog egg masses, you know that there are at least 4 females that are there, which is really cool. Their egg masses can contain like a decent amount of eggs, just about over 1,000 of them at the biggest point. And their eggs, like I said, are fairly large, and they're typically going to start laying them when it's around 43 degrees Fahrenheit. So they're usually about like our second ones to start going in the spring. And so this is a good example of the grape structure that I was talking about. So they look like a bundle of grapes, right? Like it looks like you could just take one of these and plop it off and just have like a singular egg, because there's no surrounding structure around them kind of holding them all together. And if you would look closely at one of these eggs, there's not going to be a double membrane around the center egg here. There's just going to be a jelly and maybe one other membrane surrounding that egg. Northern red-legged frog egg masses, like I said, they do spread out because there's not a lot of structure. They get a lot of debris on them. And so they can be very, very difficult to see if you're not looking very closely. And females will kind of lay these egg masses very conspicuously. And so you'll see them a lot kind of like hidden in the grassy areas and stuff like that. And they get duckweed on them, they'll get algae on them. Um, and northern red-legged frogs will usually lay their eggs in more permanent water. And so like their tadpoles need a little more time to develop and grow. And so unlike the long-toed salamander, the red-legged frog can withstand being in ponds with predators such as newts and fish and like bullfrogs. So this is just an example of a female that we found while doing one of our wetland surveys. You can see that nice dorsal fold right there. And then when we point her up, you can see that beautiful pink wash on her groin area. She was not very happy for us to measure her and take data on her. She thought it was very rude. And we can tell that this one's a female because she doesn't have big beefy arms. And if you look at their hands for males, males will usually have nuptial pads, which is just essentially this kind of overgrown area near the thumb that helps the males hold on to the females. Okay. I hope I'm not going too fast here. I'm trying to like stay within like a certain amount of time, but so northwestern salamanders are the next one. If you identify any egg mass right, it should be these guys because northern or northwestern salamanders have some of the easiest egg masses to identify. As adults, they get confused a lot with Pacific giant salamanders. But something to note about Northwesterns is that they are all a uniform color. So they are this nice, like kind of brown gray color. And they have these super large parotid glands at the front. And what those parotid glands do, as well as some of the glands on the tail, is excrete toxins, right? And so when they feel threatened by something, they go into this defensive posture and they secrete this milky substance so that if something tries to eat them, it's going to taste gross and they'll spit them back out. They are not as toxic as newts, as we will talk about, but just don't put salamanders in your mouth. Don't eat salamanders. Just a good rule of thumb. Adults can be a little hard to find with Northwesterns. They typically kind of hang out underneath logs and stuff. And you see most of them start coming out as they are shifting to their breeding ponds or kind of in the fall when they're shifting back into a nice wet area. Now, like the long-toed salamander and like the northern red-legged frog, these guys aren't strictly aquatic, with one exception that I'll talk about. So they will lay their eggs, the eggs will spend a certain amount of time in the wetland, and then they will metamorph out and become terrestrial. And a good way to identify just ambystomatids in general, like the long-toed salamander and the northwestern, they have these costal grooves on the side. So I always call them thick boys because they look like they're a little chunk, and you can actually count those costal grooves in order to identify the species accurately. Because they do emit toxins, they do very, very well in permanent water. So they can tolerate fish, they can tolerate bullfrogs, and they get fairly large as larval salamanders. And so they can become pretty voracious predators in the water themselves. Kind of something to note about Northwesterns is they can actually retain their larval characteristics and become neotenic. And so what that means is that if the conditions are right to where they don't need to metamorph out into this terrestrial adult form, they will essentially become aquatic adults. And so you will get these large Northwestern salamanders that look like larvae. They still have their gills, they still have this big flat tail, but they're just huge. And again, like people sometimes mistaken those for giant salamanders when they're in the water because they get pretty large. But again, there's no modeling on them. They are strictly this kind of like drab gray color. And their head shapes are going to be different too from the giant salamanders, even in that form. Now, their egg masses, super identifiable. They are very large. You can sometimes, with a first-year female, get a egg mass that's about golf ball size, but in general, they are very large egg masses. And their egg masses kind of look like brains. That's the best way to describe them. So all of the eggs are concealed in this nice smooth jelly, but the jelly kind of has these like little bumps. But unlike the red-legged frog, it doesn't look like you can pop each one of these off, right? Like it's contained pretty strongly in this nice structured jelly. And because of that, their egg masses tend to be pretty heavy. And so females will brace these egg masses on sticks, on cattails, on something that's going to be able to hold the weight of those. And that jelly will last as long as 10 months. So the larva will pop out of that and you can still have Northwestern like remnants of the egg masses in late fall. They'll start kind of breeding around the time that red-legged frogs will. So you'll kind of see those egg masses overlap a lot. And people can sometimes confuse the two. But again, with the red-legged frog, if you were to hold it up, it would slip between your fingers. If you would hold up a Northwestern egg mass, that thing's gonna stay in that ball shape. It is super structured. It is super sturdy. Yeah, so orange to grapefruit sized, sometimes a little smaller if you have a first-year female. And again, if you would look really closely at these eggs in here, you would see a double membrane around it. And again, that's really important when you're trying to distinguish salamanders from frogs. So if you were super unsure and you have a super fresh Northwestern egg mass, if you look really closely, you should be able to see that double membrane. When they're first laid, they're this super like fluorescent, bright white color, and it makes them really easy to see. However, females can lay those eggs a little further down into the water, which will obviously make them a little dark or a little more difficult. But their jelly, for the most part, is very clear. Now, Northwestern salamanders have this really interesting symbiotic relationship with algae. So a lot of times after about a month or two, you will see their egg masses start to turn green inside. And so it's not necessarily like there's sediment collecting on the outside of it, like you see with red-legged frogs or the long-toed salamanders, but the algae is actually inside each individual egg. And what this symbiotic relationship with this algae does is the algae will take up all of the nitrogen and like nitrogenous waste that the larva is giving off, and in return, provide the larva with oxygen. And the really cool thing about this is when the larva hatches out, the algae is still in there. So you can get like these nice big Northwestern egg masses that have nothing in them, but you still see the nice little green capsules. And again, they'll usually brace a lot on sticks, on logs, things like that, because they're pretty hefty egg masses. Something to be aware of, though, is that a lot of people also mix up bryozoa with these egg masses, which bryozoa is a whole different animal that you're dealing with, but their little colonies can also look like these guys. The algae that I was talking about. And so this is what it looks like when all of the larvae have busted out and you still get the little remnants of the algae in the egg capsules. And like the red-legged frogs, we can do a 1-to-1 ratio of females to egg masses. And so if we have a pond with 15 Northwestern egg masses in it, we know that there are at least 15 females. So yeah, so those are the two that we can actually do the 1-to-1 ratio to. So as you can see in this, I have a lot of pictures of Northwest salamander egg masses because they're really cool. And like I said, if you identify any egg mass while you're out there, this one should be like a pretty easy one to identify. So you can see here, we picked up one of the egg masses during a survey that had broken off the stick. And you can see that, I mean, it holds very firm in the hand. It's not breaking off or anything like that. It's retaining that shape really nicely. And so this is just a comparison of a northern red-legged frog egg mass to a northwestern egg mass. So you can see that the red-legged frog egg mass is really like floppy and it's kind of like, you know, falling off the hand, whereas the northwestern egg mass is staying very firm and holding its shape. So I'll talk briefly about Oregon spotted frogs. If you find Oregon spotted frogs on your property, please let DFW know. So Oregon spotted frogs are a federally listed species. They're really cool frogs, but due to habitat loss and the introduction of non-native species like bullfrog, they are unfortunately not doing great. Again, I will play you their call, but they're a little hard to hear. They're a little hard to hear.
Oregon spotted frog, Rana pretiosa.
So we always talk about Oregon spotted frogs. If you're listening for them, kind of sounds like a woodpecker or somebody just kind of like knocking on the door. So Oregon spotted frogs are strictly aquatic frogs. So these guys never like get out into the riparian or anything like that unless like absolutely necessary. And so they stay in water year round. And so because of that, their eyes are situated up top and kind of rotated at a 45-degree angle. And the reason for this is because they're strictly aquatic, but they're also really good predators. And so as they're sitting in the water, you know, they're sitting there with their little eyes like popped up above the water so they can see, you know, like little insects and little things that are coming by that they can just jump out and grab. Oregon spotted frogs, obviously by the name, have spots on their back. We can actually identify individuals based on those spots. And so they're kind of like tigers, right? So nose spotted frog has these same spots on the back. Some of them have no spots on their back. Some of them have mini spots. And a good way to identify these guys is they have this kind of red, orange, or brick wash like underneath. They do have fully webbed feet. And so if you're ever confused as to if you're coming across an Oregon spotted frog or a red-legged frog, the placement of the eyes on top, but also the feet should give it away. Because remember, northern red-legged frogs don't have webbing on their feet. It's pretty reduced, but Oregon spotted frogs have webbing all the way up the backs of their feet because they're strictly aquatic. Their egg masses are actually laid in super, super shallow water. And their egg masses look almost identical to red-legged frog egg masses. So this kind of goopy cluster of, you know, little grapes and stuff. But we're talking about them laying eggs in like an inch of water. And so prairies tend to be a really good place for Oregon spotted frogs, pastures. We have found them in people's cow pastures and stuff like that. So that kind of low water level that connects to a deeper pond is actually really good for these guys. So again, you can see this kind of cluster of them in this shallow pond. Another really cool thing about these is they're communal breeders. So unlike our other amphibians that we're talking about, as soon as one female lays her eggs somewhere, all the other females are like, oh, that seems good. Becky laid her eggs there. I guess we're all gonna lay our eggs here. And so it's very rare that you ever see like one Oregon spotted frog like egg mass somewhere without there being like at least 15 more surrounding it. And again, we can do a 1-to-1 ratio. So based on how many egg masses are there, we can tell that there's that many females, which is super important, especially with a federally listed species, that we can get population counts. So again, you can see super shallow, all of the eggs there. So each one of those accounts for a breeding female, which is awesome. Okay. Pacific tree frogs, of all of our kind of like early-ish breeders, these are the trickiest ones. Their egg packets look very similar to long-toed salamanders. And they're kind of sporadic when they decide to breed. So sometimes we'll get them a little bit after long toads. Sometimes we get them later. They're kind of random when it comes to when they decide to lay their eggs. But I will play you their call because most of you all should probably recognize this one.
Pacific chorus frog, Pseudacris regilla.
So I hope most of you all recognize that one because for being, I think it's either our smallest or our second to smallest compared to coastal tailed frogs, our Pacific tree frogs are our loudest frogs here in Washington, and they're what the indigenous cultures recognize when they're talking about frogs being a sign of spring, right? Because usually kind of like late winter, early spring, you start hearing tons of male chorus frogs, and it can be deafening. They come in a lot of different colors, so you can get brown and green and sometimes like a reddish color. But the thing that's always going to stay the same on them is this nice little mask across their face and their little round toe pads. And so that's a really easy way to distinguish these frogs from all the other frogs that we're going to talk about today. Are their circular toe pads. And those circular toe pads kind of act like gecko toe pads, right? So it helps them climb up trees. It helps them climb up the side of your shed. And that's why you find tree frogs in really odd places, is because they're really good climbers. Also, a good way to tell a male tree frog from a female tree frog is male tree frogs will actually have a black throat and female tree frogs don't have that. And so this is a nice little female tree frog, and you can tell she is very tiny. So their eggs are also laid in small packets, just like the long-toed salamanders. They also prefer to be in ephemeral sites, so sites that are going to dry up. And like the long-toed, that's just because they do not do well with predators, right? They're small, their packets are small. It's really hard when you're a small frog in a world of giant fish and other giant salamanders. And so they like laying their eggs in these nice little ephemeral ponds. They can be in kind of diverse substrates. And the larvae kind of look a little goofy. It's kind of hard to see, but if you're ever looking at their tadpoles and you look down, so like you're facing the top of them, their eyes sit on the side of their head. So it kind of breaks up that silhouette. But you could see how this would be really confusing as compared to a long-toed salamander because they're both small. But the thing to note is that tree frog egg packets will usually have a lot more eggs in them than a long-toed, and their eggs are very, very tiny compared to long-toed salamanders, which it's hard if you don't have them right next to each other to see that. But here's a good example. So this is a long-toed salamander egg, and these are Pacific tree frog eggs. And so you can kind of see that there is some bicoloration on the Pacific tree frogs, but there's more of a nice like blending gradient. Whereas long-toed salamanders, there's distinct bicolor. So like the top is dark and the bottom is light. And again, if you would look closely at this, there's not that double membrane around it like you get with long-toed salamanders. Like I said, tree frogs tend to have more eggs in their packet, and they are a lot smaller than the salamander eggs do. And just like a little quiz, even though I can't like really hear you all, but these are actually two different frogs. And the way that you would be able to tell these apart is this one has this nice mask. If you would look at the toes, they're circular. And if you would look at this one, you would notice there's no circular toes. It does kind of have a mask, but the webbing on the back feet are also reduced. So this is a juvenile red-legged frog, and this is an adult Pacific tree frog. All right, Western toads. If you don't like toads, I really hope that I am getting ready to change your mind, because toads might be one of the most adorable amphibians that we have in Washington. They're chunky, they're cute, they're super, super clumsy. Unfortunately, there haven't been any records of Western toads breeding in Thurston County. But if you think you find them, again, letting Stream Team know, letting DFW know, because we need to know where their populations are. And this is what they sound like.
Western toad, Bufo boreas.
I mean, they even sound cute. They even sound cute. So Western toads can be distinguished from all other frogs, right? So all toads are frogs, but not all frogs are toads. And the way you distinguish these is they have these nice warts all over their back, and this nice dorsal stripe. Now, the dorsal stripe can be a little hard to see sometimes in younger individuals, but it is always going to be there. And so that's a really good way to distinguish the toads from a lot of our other frogs. They are incredibly clumsy. They're not very good jumpers. Oftentimes, if the toad is running away from you, it is diving headfirst into a rock. When they get into the water, they swim once, so they'll push off once, and then they just kind of float there. So they're really they're living their best toad lives as well as they can. And there are not a lot of predators that will actually eat toads. And the reason for that is because the Western toad, like a lot of other toads in the family, emit bufotoxin. And bufotoxin is very toxic to a lot of animals. These are not toads that you want to lick as a human. It will make you incredibly, incredibly sick. And of all of the animals in the animal kingdom, there are only a few animals that have mastered being able to eat these guys. Look at, they're just adorable. They're just so adorable. So their egg masses are actually pretty distinctive compared to all other frogs. They actually lay their egg masses in strings. And the best way I can describe this is they look like spaghetti noodles. And so females will release 2 strands of eggs, so 2 strands per female. And we can do the 1-to-1 ratio with toads, but it can get a little complicated because, as you can imagine, these strings can get intertangled with one another. Toads will usually start breeding in the summer, so they need kind of warmer water. And when I tell you that they lay a lot, their egg masses can contain over 20,000 eggs in them. And so that's why when you see schools of tadpoles of toads, it just looks like this little black mass of tadpoles just swimming at you. Their tadpoles are completely black, and they school up together. Their jelly breaks down relatively quickly. And a really cool thing about Western toads is they are considered stillwater breeders, but in certain systems in Washington, including the Chehalis Basin, Western toads will actually breed in rivers. And we're not entirely sure why that is, but you get toads that will basically breed in like these slower moving parts of the river. Sometimes they'll breed in like the little ponds that form on the gravel bars. But yeah, I guess they're just extreme toads and just like living on the dangerous side. So as you can see, this is their little egg strands. So this is all from one female that she has just folded back and forth. And so you can see that like this doesn't look like any of the other egg masses like whatsoever. Sometimes you will get a red-legged frog female who, for whatever reason, has not bunched her eggs up into an egg mass, but the Western toad egg masses are still going to be like a smooth noodle instead of a bunch of little like grape noodles. And so this was a pair of toads in Amplexus laying their eggs. And then you can see all of these lovely little tadpoles that are schooling up from these egg masses. And this is also why when you get into the late summer and these guys start metamorphing out into little toadlets, you get so many little toadlets on these gravel bars and around wetlands. And it just seems like a plague of adorableness that is happening. So this is just like a nice little video of the thousands of tadpoles that we were looking at on the river. Okay, so rough-skinned newts. These are probably one of the most common amphibians that most of you have run into. They are very distinguishable by that nice orange belly. They've got the brown top. And these guys will start laying their eggs anywhere from February to around the beginning of summer. So kind of like the tree frogs, they're a little mix and match with when they decide to breed. Something to note, do not lick or ingest rough-skinned newts. So rough-skinned newts are one of the most toxic amphibians in North America. So they excrete tetrodotoxin, which is a sodium channel inhibitor, which is the same thing that pufferfish have. And there are some populations of rough-skinned newts that are so toxic that they can kill humans if it's ingested. So again, rule of thumb, do not stick salamanders in your mouth. They're pretty identifiable because when they're on land, they tend to have this kind of granular skin. And again, that nice orange belly is a dead giveaway for them. They are called rough-skinned newts, but when they're in their aquatic form, a lot of times, especially the males, are a lot smoother on top. But again, that yellow or that orange belly is still going to be very prominent. And newts will do this defensive posture stance called unking if they're irritated enough, where they will lift their chin up and flip their tail forward to make that bright orange underside super apparent. And a really cool thing about newts, and like one of the reasons why they're so toxic in the Pacific Northwest, is because they have been involved in this evolutionary arms race with the common garter snake, so Thamnopsis sirtalis. And like the cool thing about this is that garter snakes are the only things on the planet that can eat rough-skinned newts, and that's because they have co-evolved next to them. So the more toxic the newts become, the more the garter snakes build up this immunity to the tetrodotoxin. And so garter snakes are able to eat these things pretty easily until the newts become too toxic, and then it hurts the garter snakes. And so it's a back and forth thing. Newts are some of our hardier amphibians, and so they can be found in a lot of diverse permanent aquatic habitats. It does take them a while to metamorph out, and so they generally like permanent water. We have found them in very polluted waters before, and they seem to be thriving. But most notably, newts are egg eaters. And so if there is any other amphibian in that kind of like aquatic system with them, they will 100% go after those eggs and try to eat those eggs, which the northwestern salamander has that really thick jelly around it, so it kind of helps, but newts have evolved to be able to basically excavate down into it. And newt eggs are kind of interesting because females can lay multiple eggs, but they will only lay them singly. So a female might lay 25 single eggs and she will lay them all around the pond. So she usually doesn't lay them just in one place. And these can be kind of hard to distinguish from long-toed salamanders, but a good rule of thumb with newt eggs is that that jelly is going to be super, super tight around that egg. So you can see those double membranes around this one, and then the outside jelly is also super close to those. And what females will do is they will lay the single egg, usually on some type of aquatic vegetation, and then use her back legs to then wrap that vegetation around the egg, concealing it. Which is interesting because their eggs are also toxic. So this little guy still contains tetrodotoxin. So it's still a pretty toxic meal for anything that tries to eat it. And their larvae are pretty distinctly bicolored. So you can see that it's got like this nice little orange belly, just like the adults do. This was a pond that we surveyed in an alpine lake, and there were no other amphibians in this pond except for these newts. And we counted at least an estimate of about 8,000 newts in this pond. And you can see they just kind of like hang out there. And Um, yeah, so like I said, their eggs are brown above with this pale yellow belly. Um, they're often not laid close together. Newts will eat other newts too. Like they have no bounds when it comes to like what they're trying to eat. And they'll do it in relatively warm water. So they also have this symbiotic relationship with algae, just like the northwestern salamander does. However, their symbiotic relationship actually happens within the gut of the larva. So sometimes you'll see larvae with this kind of green coloration on the inside of it, and that's actually that algae inside the larva instead of inside the egg casing. All right, last but certainly not least, the American bullfrog. Now, the genus name for this has gone back and forth from Rana to Lithobates, but the frog is one and the same. American bullfrogs are non-native and highly invasive in Washington. Maybe a common frog that you all have seen. This pretty token, like green, large frog, and this is their call.
Bullfrog. Rana catesbiana.
So you can also, when bullfrogs, the juveniles are around ponds, if you start walking around a pond, typically when the juveniles are getting ready to jump into the water, they'll sound off an alarm call to warn other frogs. So it'll kind of sound like a meow, and then they'll jump into the pond. So if you have a lot of them and you start walking, you'll hear that quite a bit. Bullfrogs are very, very large. A good way to identify these guys is that dorsolateral fold that I was talking about in the red-legged frog. They do not have that. So that fold just wraps around that tympanum, which is their eardrum, and does not continue down the back. Bullfrogs typically are solid green, but you get some with like some spotting on the back of them. They're super large. Their tadpoles are large. They're large. Their juveniles, when they first metamorph out, tend to be like kind of small, and their eggs themselves are pretty small, but they're very large frogs. They will eat anything that they can fit into their mouth, which is why they cause an issue. We have had bullfrogs eat Western pond turtles. They will eat birds. They will eat mammals. And of course, they eat our other native amphibians. Tadpoles, like I said, can grow very large, and it usually takes them about 2 to 4 years to metamorph. So bullfrogs absolutely need permanent water. And so sometimes when we're trying to eradicate bullfrogs in an area, you will hear about people draining like man-made ponds and stuff like that in order to get the bullfrogs out. Surprisingly enough, though, their egg masses are really, they're thin and they look like sheets instead of like the clumped together egg mass. And the eggs themselves are super, super tiny. And they're usually kind of laid like close to grass and sticks, but the amount of eggs is what makes bullfrogs terrifying as invasive species. So in one egg mass alone that one female lays, that egg mass can contain anywhere from 8 to 120,000 eggs per egg mass. And females can double lay. So a female might lay an egg mass early in the summer, because bullfrogs will only breed in the summer. So they're warm. They need like that warm water. They need that warm air temperature in order for them to breed. So we'll usually run across their egg masses in the summer. And females can lay a large egg mass at the beginning of the summer, retain some of that, and then later in the summer do a second clutch. So a female might lay an egg mass that contains 120,000 eggs in her first one and be like, I think I'm going to lay another one later and lay one that still contains 50,000 eggs in it. So you can imagine that it is very, very difficult to keep these things under control once they have established a population. And so as you can see, the eggs themselves within the mass are extremely tiny. And they can be really hard to see because they're flat, they're laid along vegetation, and they will get debris on them very easily. So yeah, bullfrogs are definitely They're a hard one. They are a hard species for us to manage as a whole in Washington. We also know that bullfrogs are really good carriers of chytrid and ranavirus, and it doesn't affect them. And so then they become these carriers to other species that are within the system. So yeah, just another example of like how small the eggs are. And then this is a huge bullfrog egg mass with a bunch of debris on the top of it. And so again, because this isn't like a globular egg mass, it makes it extremely difficult to see if you're not actively looking for them. Now, I'm not going to go through the quiz because this is easier to do in person. It is not as easy to do when you are like virtually like this, but I'll go through some of these slowly and kind of try to guess, you know, like what they are. When I say slowly, I mean not really that slowly. Like I said, the long-tooth salamanders and the Pacific tree frogs get confused a lot. But whole reason for this, why this is important and why we need you. So the decline of amphibians is one of the scariest things when we talk about conservation. So amphibians consist of about 7,000 known species, and we're still continuing to find more. And 1/3 of those species are threatened. So we're looking at close to 2,000 species of those 7,000 that are threatened. And within the last 2 decades, we know that 168 species have believed to gone completely extinct. And 25,000 of them have populations that are rapidly declining, including some of our native amphibians here in Washington. And this is why this is important. So we hear conservation stories of wanting to save tigers and these big, beautiful megafauna, but amphibians are what we call our canaries in the coal mine, right? So amphibians are really, really sensitive to pollutions in their ecosystem because their skin is highly absorbent and it's highly sensitive. And so when we start noticing that amphibians are declining and we start noticing that all of a sudden they're going extinct in these areas, it triggers this mentality that something is wrong in that ecosystem. And if we don't catch that, then it's a lot harder to save these big megafauna. And people often overlook the importance of amphibians and insects and all of these things that can really give us an idea of how well an ecosystem is doing. And this is why you all are important. So we are all scientists. Everybody in this meeting right now are scientists. And the beautiful thing about conservation is conservation takes everyone to help out with this. So you going out, being able to identify these amphibians, being able to identify the egg masses, and then helping scientists collect that data helps us know how our amphibian populations are doing, which in turn helps us know how our aquatic ecosystems are doing, which helps the salmon, which helps the elk, which helps all of our ecosystems here in Washington. And again, that's what conservation is about, is everybody working together to save our home. And so I'm so, so happy that you all are super stoked about amphibians. They're super cute and they're awesome. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen. I will take any questions and hopefully answer them to the best of my abilities. So yeah.
I will actually add to that. One of the reasons that we do our program, and as I stated before, we're funded by the Stormwater Utility, and stormwater is one of the most toxic waters for amphibians. So a lot of our amphibians will, since they can lay their eggs in water that is permanent and non-permanent, they also choose stormwater ponds. And if a stormwater pond especially is coming, has stormwater. So stormwater is any water that is coming after a rain. So we have a lot of impervious surfaces, meaning that it doesn't soak into the ground. So that water from I-5, other roads, off our rooftops, it flows into storm ponds or other areas, but it also flows right directly into our streams and wetlands. So a lot of those toxins, and most of them are from cars. So reducing car use, but also doing things like taking your car to a car wash regularly. Don't wait up and hold it, and only do it once a year, because that pollution actually is on your car itself. So, and the copper from copper brakes. The brake linings for copper, they have a mandate to stop using copper in brakes, but it's going to take many years to actually get it so that none of our brakes have copper. And copper is highly toxic to many animals. So we at Stream Team, I have a egg mass monitoring program, and you may sign up for that. There's not a lot of openings at this time. We're kind of keeping our numbers reduced with COVID, and hopefully folks that actually sign up will attend. If not, I'll be communicating with them early on so that there's openings that you can actually sign up and take those places. We don't have a lot of ponds that are appropriate for kids. I do have Hansen Pond. It's a stormwater pond that's more appropriate because it's not as deep. And if there's ever ponds that are shallow enough, I love having kids be able to come out. Most of the time, though, it's over people's boots, short boots. And we do supply waders for volunteers coming out to help us. I wanted to say something about the Western toads. We actually this year had a couple folks call us in Fish and Wildlife. They were out at the pumpkin farm, out Hunter Farms, out off the Elm Highway, and there was scads of little baby toadlets everywhere. So they're spawning out there, and I was hoping we could do some surveys out there, but most of those ponds are private and not accessible for us to go out and monitor. But another easy place that's public is Lake Cushman. So you can just be down on the river at Lake Cushman and you'll see little toadlets in the fall. So, and they're tadpoles in the spring. So any questions for Lamise? You can raise your hand or just turn off your audio and speak.
I was asking about helping frogs in our gardens and encouraging them. And I got Water Resources did give us a good answer, but if you had anything to add, that would be awesome.
I basically stated planting native plants, and they like shade and moist, large leaves for cover.
Yeah, you can also add like some woody debris too around the ponds, because like adults like hiding underneath like logs and stuff like that. So that's also a good way to promote them, because then it provides them some home when they're not in the water. So yeah, native plants, lots of woody debris for them to hide underneath, and yeah, because that'll also promote bugs, and they need a food source too.
Cool. Yes, we were told. I saw online that some people put like a broken clay plant pot down, like kind of like a little house. I didn't know if that helps or not, but I have seen a couple of those little green tree frogs, which was really exciting.
Hey,
So.
yeah, that's awesome.
So Tessa actually had a comment about that, saying that one of her professors said to bundle up sticks and branches in the shade and then cover them with mulch, and that makes good habitat. It also makes good gardener snake habitat.
Hey, I have a question. I'm in like Tumwater, Olympia, and I wanted to know what ponds or lakes around here would be good, easy places for me to look for frogs.
So McLean Creek Nature Trail is packed with rough-skinned newts. There's a lot of Northwest salamander egg masses that you can see out there. It's one of my favorite places to take people to, especially around this time of the year, to see amphibians. So definitely highly recommend it.
And a lot of our ponds, if we have, there's spawning out at Miller, Sylvania, and in the springtime, they'll actually lay their eggs in the mud puddles out there. So last year when I was out, the ranger out there was actually talking about the tadpoles that were in some of the mud puddles, but also that wetland system is pretty shallow in places. So you might be able to see them there. And any of their public, Chambers Creek, the Chambers Lake, you may be able to see some around the lake and also like out at Black Lake. But Black Lake has a lot of bullfrogs. So you may have a lot of predation. They like that shallower water, so that within 4 foot of water with a lot of bracing. So it needs to have a lot of either pondweed or any of the sedges and rushes and any other type of, long, tall type of vegetation that they can attach to.
Nisqually Wildlife Refuge is also another good one. You can see egg masses out there. The sheer number of tree frogs that you will see is also pretty amazing, and you'll see a lot of different like color variation and stuff in them too. So,
and if you're a golfer, the Tumwater Golf Course, the the ponds out there, even though there's almost no vegetation, and we've seen less and less amphibians over time because the vegetation gets worse and the sediment gets higher in those ponds. But you can see red-legged frog masses floating on top and the Northwest salamanders.
Awesome. Thank you.
So I had somebody ask if I have ever been able to find a rough-skinned newt egg. Yes, very rarely. We will find them in our surveys, and it usually comes from, we use dip nets to dip up like adults and stuff like that. That has really been the only way that we have come across newt eggs, because they are very conspicuous and very small. So.
There's also places like here in Olympia on 12th Avenue, which is if you're going out South Bay, that roadway floods. And there's other areas where you have flooding in ditches right next to the road. And you'll find egg masses in those areas as well. Somebody asked on identifying African clawed frog egg masses. Actually, I have no information, maybe Lamise does, but those areas where there are African clawed frogs and where you know that there are clawed frogs, U.S. Fish and Wildlife has been trying to keep people out of those areas so that they don't get spread to, because they are voracious eaters and they dig down in the mud and they can hibernate for very long times. So most of those ponds, they have protection around them, have gates around them or fencing so that the frogs can't get out. And they're really wanting people to stay out of those ponds. So please don't go looking for egg masses for those frogs or the adults. And educate your friends, educate people about not dumping their pets. So the African clawed frogs are a real typical frog that is sold in pet stores. Don't buy them. Don't buy them. Don't let your friends buy them. And if you do have them, or your friends have them, or know people that have them, educate about not dumping exotic pets, because exotic pets become invasive species and they eat our native species. And the whole thing with any native invasive species, whether it be an animal or a plant, it actually is more competitive than our native species. They grow faster and they don't have predators of their own, so they pretty much go unchecked.
Yeah, somebody also asked too about if there was anything they could change about their homes that could help, like cleaners and soaps or anything like that. I'm not too familiar on the subject as far as like pollutants. I do tell people to be very cautious when you get into systems with amphibians. If you have DEET, any type of mosquito repellent, or even sunscreen, because they are incredibly sensitive to things like that. So just being very cognizant of that. Like if you ever, for some reason, feel the need to pick up an amphibian or anything, just making sure that you don't have some type of residue on your hands, even if it's like hand sanitizer, because that can hurt them.
Yeah, because you have to remember that they, their skins are how they respirate. So anything that we actually have on our bodies transfer to them. Other chemicals, most of our products are low in phosphates, but phosphate is one of the pollutants for water. But also things like, the big fad was buying soaps with glitter and sparkly things and little bubble beads. All of that is plastic toxins. And if it's not going into the wetland, it is going into Puget Sound, and it is going into our streams. And out in Puget Sound, they are finding that things like all your bivalves of oysters and what have you, they uptake it, and they're finding them, ingesting them. And those things are microplastics, which is a huge pollutant that's really hard to get out of the environment. The other thing that we teach about is decontamination. So whenever we're out in the field, we decontaminate our boots, and we ask people, if you're out slogging around in wetlands, that every time you decontaminate your boots before you go into another wetland, because there is a chytrid fungus that actually is another disruptor of amphibian skin. And Lamise may be able to talk better towards this. But you can if you've got mud and debris on your boots, you leave that mud and debris right there at the same pond that you were coming out of. And then there are, I believe it's a 10% Clorox that you soak your boots in. It doesn't work. It works for mud snails in our area to freeze them, but it doesn't work for chytrid. So you really need to scrub your boots up and use Clorox is probably the best one. They also say 409, but all of these cleaning products are toxic to any type of organism. So you can't actually have it in water, and you don't want to be doing it in water. You want to be doing it at home and then putting it down into the sanitary sewer, the wastewater.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know more about chytrid that you can talk about?
I mean, like I talked about earlier, how bullfrogs are a really good carrier of it. And so we do have some, this also harkens back to like the importance of, like not releasing your pets, because African clawed frogs too are also really good carriers of chytrid without it affecting them whatsoever. And so they're kind of like asymptomatic, right? And so once they get into an ecosystem with some of our other amphibians, what chytrid does is it causes these amphibians to grow like these extra layers of skin that they start like shedding off, and it's like very uncomfortable. It can be very devastating to a lot of populations. So yeah, when you jump into, even when you're walking on nature trails, if you're walking anywhere like McLean or anywhere that's like really wet and moist, where it's possible that like you are coming into contact with some of like the water from that ecosystem, just when you get home, just scrub down, like your boots and stuff like that, and then let them dry. And then that way too, like once you rinse them off and stuff, you can take them back out and go to a different system, because we really don't want to spread that around. There are a couple of other diseases that we're on the lookout for, and it's the same thing. And so just really making sure that you are being cognizant of things like that. So
another question somebody had is just about their aquariums in general. those little moss balls that you can purchase in the pet stores for your aquarium. You don't want to throw those into any water source. They actually usually have an invasive snails in them. And sometimes you don't see them. Sometimes you never see them. I've had moss balls in my aquarium, and then I got a couple other plants and never had snails. And now all of a sudden I have snails. So their eggs are so tiny and then they hatch out. So you don't want to be, you don't want to be pouring that water outside. And if you have a natural pond, put it down the drain. And if you are getting rid of your plants in your aquarium or your moss balls, you can throw it in the garbage, or you could probably throw it into the waste, into your compost bin. It should be hot enough to actually kill those organisms. But to be on the safe side, you might want to just actually put it in the garbage can. Somebody else asked about standing water. We don't have a lot of problems with non-native mosquitoes or West Nile. I know we do have some West Nile in Washington that has been discovered, but if you have a small pond, you're not going to have a lot of issues with mosquitoes, especially if you have habitat for birds, or if you have, we have bats, we have birds, we have other things that eat insects. We need our insects, and mosquitoes are one of those sources of food for our amphibians and for our other flying critters. And if you don't have a water source, bowls of water outside for birds, for amphibians, even reptiles, and other things that may actually come into your yard is actually a good thing. And you just keep it changed so it isn't, you can keep your mosquito larvae in check by changing it more often. So, any more questions?
Hi, I'm wondering a little more about the life cycle of the tree frog, the Pacific tree frog. And it's possible that you talked about this because my little one, I've been watching and then being a little distracted. But so we found this like nursery for them where we found little tiny frogs, but it's dry. And so we were wondering, like where are their eggs and where are they tadpoles?
So most likely if like the water is dry now, like when you see the frogs themselves, at some point during the winter, there is probably a water source somewhere where they're laying those eggs. And so where tree frogs are like long-toed salamanders, like they're gonna lay their eggs in areas where it dries up quickly. And so it doesn't take a lot of time for them to go from eggs to tadpoles to tiny little froglets. Because they know the water is going to dry up. And so they get cues from their ecosystems, and like their surroundings of being like basically stressing and like forcing them to metamorph out faster. And like sometimes if it dries up too quickly, then, that little like cluster of eggs is lost. But yeah, I mean, it could be something as much as a tire rut. Somewhere you've got a tire rut somewhere like near you or on your property, and those little tree frogs are just going to town there. You can also, during this time of year, if you follow their calls, because males are going to be calling like from those areas, so follow their calls and you can usually run into the area where there's water.
And they do have, part of their life cycle is living in the uplands. Mm-hmm. So they're going to be living in the forested areas, in the grassy areas, and on those edges. So you're not always going to be near their water source where they're ovidepositing. And like with the red-legged frogs, they will go several miles. Isn't that accurate?
Yeah, 5 kilometers. So like red-legged frogs can go as far as 3 miles away from their ponds. So.
And then we've had at Stream Team, we've also had night surveys for migrating amphibians over roadways, because a lot of our populations of amphibians that are next to where we have roads next to ponds, there'll be a lot of migration during the night and they get squished on the roads. There's different things that the road departments can do with culverts and different passages underneath the road for amphibians. But just, on a nice, warm, rainy fall night, you can actually, if you're out and about, be careful driving in those areas that that there's wetlands, but you can actually identify where your wetland sources are. And in the spring, then you can go back and find where they're spawning or laying their eggs. So.
Thank you. We found there's these little holes in the ground around where we see a lot of the froglets. Is that maybe them like digging a hole?
They won't normally dig holes, but they will kind of like hunker down into like insect burrows, or sometimes like crawfish shoots, or like little rodent burrows, because it's nice little shelter. But their little like toe pads aren't like super designed to like dig through or anything. So those holes are probably created by something else, and they're just kind of like hunkering down in there for safety.
So one other thing we haven't talked about is with climate change. So even here in Thurston County and on the west side of the Cascades, our summers are becoming longer and much hotter. Last year we had that 109 degrees, which is like ridiculous for here, but our amphibian populations are really going to be suffering. Their ponds are going to dry faster. And in the summertime, they're going to need much more shade. So if you start planting more native plants, and there's courses you can take and other things online that'll talk about native plants that are more resilient in drought conditions. So you can put out more bowls of water for them and make little pond areas and more vegetation. So that'll actually help them in the long run. So it is going to be an issue. So the other issue with climate change is our bullfrog populations. Right now, the larvae, they actually develop into adults in about 2 years. And it's predicted that if we have warmer weather longer, that they may actually increase their metamorphosis to 1 year. So then we have even more egg laying of bullfrogs. So. Any other questions? Thanks, Lamise. It's been fun seeing you again.
Yeah.
And great to have you.
Yeah, I can put my email in the chat too if anybody has any questions. Obviously, feel free to reach out to me or Michelle. I'm always happy to answer frog questions.
And Department of Fish and Wildlife, they have